They never told you what was buried beneath the meat markets of Salt Lake. And they never will. But someone kept the ledgers. Someone remembered the taste of what they sold. The year was 1804. The land was wild, untouched by mercy. Before Utah was even a state, caravans vanished in the canyons, bones turned up in riverbeds, and meat that didn't quite smell like beef kept showing up in barrels stamped with Christian crosses. If you're hearing this, it's because something in you already suspects the truth. That history was never about facts, it was about control. And what they buried under the myths of Mormon settlers, frontier justice, and manifest destiny, is a truth so dark, so monstrous, that it had to be rewritten, forgotten, sealed inside family names no history book dares print. The butcher families of Utah. That's what they were called in secret. Whispered in outlaw bars and mining towns. Families who didn't just slaughter animals. They sold meat during winters where no cows were reported killed. They grew rich while others starved. Their smokehouses never froze, and their children never wept from hunger. And yet, livestock records don't match their wealth. The missing persons reports. Burned. The graveyards. Too shallow. They were tradesmen of flesh, flesh like yours. This isn't conspiracy. This is blood ledger history, the kind your textbooks skipped. And in this video, you will descend into the madness they masked as civilization. You will taste what they fed the nation. And you will never forget it. But make no mistake, this isn't just about a crime. This is about a system. Because the truth isn't what happened. The truth is how they got away with it. There are names I will speak, records I will reveal. But know this. Once you begin this descent, there is no returning to the comfort of ignorance. You will awaken something old, something hungry. So, buckle in, close the door, silence the noise, because you're about to walk into a darkness that smells like smoked meat and screams. And by the time this is over, you won't know if you're still hungry, or if something's now hungry for you. Salt Lake Valley, 1812. The soil was dry, the winters cruel, and the wagons that passed through, untraceable. That's where the trail begins. Not in scripture or sermons, but in the smokehouses of families whose names have been erased. Men like Elias Greeley, Josiah Cotter, Martha Bellamy, pioneers on the surface, butchers by trade, providers to the early Mormon settlements. But if you dared look closely, their livestock pens were always suspiciously empty. No cows, just barrels, just meat, just silence. See, this isn't about superstition. This is about patterns. In 1827, an entire group of fur trappers disappeared on their way to trade near the Wasatch Range. No violence found, no signs of native conflict. But their names vanish from all records. Coincidentally, the same winter, Salt Lake's main butchery ran 2 weeks without receiving a single shipment of livestock, yet somehow increased their sales. Church elders claimed it was a miracle. Survivors from nearby towns said the meat tasted off, but was tender. The locals were told to pray, and they did, because they didn't want to know. But the ledgers? Oh, the ledgers, they tell a different story. A pattern of missing people followed by surges in special meat, delivered in secret wagons, covered with cloth, marked not with names, but with symbols. The same symbols found etched on cellar doors under homes now buried in Salt Lake's foundations. Hand-carved runes, untranslated, never spoken aloud. You want real history? Here it is. This nation wasn't built on freedom. It was built on forgetting, on hiding sins deep in the snow. And these families, they were the ones who did the dirty work. They didn't just feed the town, they fed it people. And the institutions knew, because when you follow the names, when you pull that blood-soaked thread, you find marriages into political families, land deeds protected by governors, trials that were never held, and churches that quietly moved the butcher families out of Utah, just as new railroads brought more wagons, more travelers, more meat. Ask yourself this: if the government and the Church of Latter-day Saints knew this was happening, and still protected it, what else have they fed you? And if they erased this, what did they leave behind for you to find? Keep going. But tread carefully. This descent doesn't end in history, it ends in you. In 1834, a series of cold cellar floods hit the valley. Harsh rain, ice storms, foundations cracked open, homes bled secrets. One in particular, the Bellamy homestead, suffered what neighbors called a curse. The basement collapsed after a week of storms. What the town sheriff found was never officially documented. But the letters? The letters survived. A 19th-century lawman named Harlan Fitch wrote in a personal note to his brother, "There's a smell down there I cannot describe. The walls weep like skin. They told me not to write this, but I swear to you, that's not pig bone." He was found dead the following winter. Fell on his own knife, the coroner claimed. But Harlan's boots were missing. his tongue had been cut out. And the Bellamy house, it was sold for pennies and converted into a church school. That's the pattern. Each time someone got too close, they either vanished or were absorbed by the very institutions that claimed to protect the people. Let's talk about the cellars. Every butcher family had one, reinforced with brick, carved deep into the earth. Some even had iron rings bolted into the walls. For curing meat, they claimed. But human remains were found years later when those homes were demolished. And every time a body turned up, partial skeletons, jawbones, small rib cages, the report listed Native American burial site and moved on convenient. Why weren't these families charged? Because they were the law. In early Utah settlements, church leaders were the judges, the butchers were the deacons, and the landowners were all related. These were not outliers. These were pillars, cannibals hiding behind faith, murderers cloaked in scripture, and those cellars. They weren't just places of storage, they were temples. Shrines to something older. In one excavation beneath the Cotter property, archaeologists found bones arranged in spirals, not buried, but displayed. Some cleaned, some scorched, one even had carvings. Ancient markings traced back to pre-Columbian blood rites. So what does that tell you? This wasn't just hunger. This was ritual, controlled, institutional, and protected. Ask yourself, if a family can feed a city human flesh for decades without consequence, who's really in control? And more importantly, how many of their descendants are still feeding you today? You've heard of the Mormon Trail, but what they never tell you, what they bury beneath sermons and slogans, is that along those same wagon tracks a darker trade flowed, not of gold, not of salt, but of flesh. From 1837 to 1853, at least 142 reported disappearances occurred between Fort Bridger and Salt Lake. Entire wagon parties, lost to snow, killed by tribes, eaten by wolves, they claimed, but there were no tracks, no arrowheads, no blood trails. Just silence and wagons that returned lighter than they should have, yet somehow more profitable. Now look closer. In those same years, several frontier butchers grew inexplicably wealthy. Elias Greeley, a man who once begged for flour in 1829, suddenly owned 3 smokehouses, a cattle ranch with no cattle, and a rail contract to ship preserved meats eastward to Denver, Omaha, and even Chicago. But the livestock numbers never matched the export weight. Ranch inspectors filed reports. Auditors asked questions. Then, nothing. Reports disappeared. Auditors quit. Their families relocated. Greeley expanded. How? Because by then, the trade wasn't just tolerated, it was institutionalized. In 1842, a paper trail surfaced church authorized meat shipments marked donation cuts. It was supposed to be salted pork for impoverished rail workers, but in a manifest recovered from a warehouse fire near Provo, one line item read, 72 lb, CERBT, grade A, no hoof no hide she rub, the term used for the softest parts of a child. Now let that sit with you. They weren't just butchers, they were suppliers. And they weren't feeding cults in basements. They were feeding the nation's builders. Men laying tracks, digging tunnels, constructing the skeleton of a country. Powered by blood-fed labor, both literal and metaphorical. It was commerce. Flesh for progress. And once you understand that, everything changes, because the government contracts came next. Then military rations. Then prison food. Think about it. How often do we truly know what we're eating? How many times has a label lied to you with a smile? And still, no prosecution, no headlines. Just buried history. You see, when murder becomes supply chain, justice becomes inconvenient. And when consumption is quiet, hidden in sealed tins and smoked skins, no one questions the taste. They just chew, swallow, forget. You've tasted this world before. But now you're beginning to see it. In the dusty attic of a condemned home in Bingham Canyon, Utah, a discovery was made that never reached the public. The house belonged to the Cotter family, one of the original butcher bloodlines. Inside a sealed trunk, under a false floorboard, were 3 hand-bound books wrapped in waxed cloth. At first glance, they appeared to be pioneer cookbooks. But the recipes weren't meant for pigs. One reedy, Sunday stew, marrow scraped youngling, firm flank slices, 3-night salt cure, lemon balm for the guilt. Another, sacrament roast for blessings and power. Skin must be pierced before the 7th hour. Feed to only the chosen. This wasn't survival. This was ritual. They gave the dishes names to mask what they were. Cherub cutlets, penitent pie, blessing meat. And they didn't just pass these recipes among themselves. They taught their daughters. They embedded the instructions into family meals. Grandmothers whispered measurements to granddaughters. Fathers hunted under the guise of morality. What began as scarcity turned into legacy. This is how you program a family. You make the horror domestic. You make the ritual mundane. You turn trauma into tradition. And soon, no one even asks what they're eating. It's just how it's always been. And the deeper horror. Some of those families never left Utah. They changed their names, moved to cities, opened restaurants, taught culinary arts, and the recipes, they evolved. Some were edited for legal safety. Others were encrypted with symbols only the bloodline would understand. Salted language, hidden intent. Now ask yourself, how many times have you watched a cooking show where the chef smirks and says, "It's an old family recipe"? How many times have you eaten something unusual at a backwoods diner and laughed it off? What if we told you that some of those same recipe codes turned up in prison kitchens in the 1950s, in military mess halls during the Korean War, and even in five-star restaurants known for exotic meats? What if these cookbooks were never buried, just disguised? You're not just what you eat, you're what they fed you without your consent. You want mastery, awareness, control? Then know this, control. The moment you question the taste, you awaken the predator in a world built to make you prey. And if you're still with me, you're beginning to digest the truth. By 1845, something changed. The killings weren't just for profit. The consumption wasn't just for survival. It became doctrine. Hidden beneath the surface of pioneer churches and backwoods tabernacles was an offshoot sect, one never recognized publicly by the LDS institution, yet strangely protected by it. It called itself the Church of the Divine Flesh. Their creed: to consume is to commune, to digest is to ascend. Their founders were butcher priests. Their altars, cutting tables, their sacraments, fresh organs salted with hymns. Not metaphors, not parables, flesh, real human, consecrated. They believed that the consumption of the human body, especially the young, especially the unbaptized wanderer, was the highest form of spiritual connection. That in every bite of the innocent, one devoured not just meat but power. They didn't just kill. They harvested. Witnesses, rare, broken men who escaped their indoctrination, described churches where the pews faced slaughter racks, choirs singing over screams, infants swaddled in meat cloth as offerings, and most disturbing of all, the seventh stew, a ritual meal fed to the congregation that left them euphoric, obedient, and forever silent. We have journals, secret notes from rail workers, letters smuggled out by a missionary who vanished weeks later. These weren't insane ramblings. These were detailed reports, consistent, chilling, precise. And then the disappearances began again. But this time it wasn't travelers. It was their own. Children born within the Church of the Divine Flesh were recorded, raised, and eventually served. The bloodlines devoured themselves in a cycle of sacred consumption, a religious machine that fed on its flock. And the authorities, they came once. In 1849, a federal agent, Solomon Price, launched an investigation into ritualistic activity and unnatural death, tied to a congregation outside Tuile. His last known letter read, "If God walks here, he is made of blood." His body was found crucified upside down in a barn. No suspects, no arrests, his report classified, lost. You see, when belief meets appetite, when God becomes a butcher's blade, institutions look the other way. Because a people fed on blood are easy to lead, easy to shape, easy to silence. And when you can turn flesh into salvation, you don't need a pulpit. You need a kitchen. If this truth feels like it's tearing something inside you, good. That's the old programming breaking. Look around you. The names on buildings. The foundation's funding, moral reform. The wealthy families who appear in history books without origin. Who seem to rise from nowhere with land influence and immunity. You think success just happens. It doesn't. It's passed down. And in Utah it was soaked in blood. The Cotters, Greeley's, Bellamy's, the original butcher clans, didn't disappear. They evolved, changed names, married into money, created companies, banks, law firms. And more importantly, they donated, they funded charities, churches, orphanages, political campaigns, all while keeping the one thing that truly mattered: control over what people eat, think, and believe. One Greeley descendant became a senator. Another ran a prison food distribution network. A Bellamy heir owns one of the largest meatpacking plants in the western U.S. A place accused of illegal labor, animal cruelty, and shipping mislabeled products. But the lawsuits vanished. Inspectors retired. Whistleblowers went missing. Again, the pattern repeats. Why? Because they don't just run companies, they run systems. The flesh trade taught them everything they needed. How to feed a population without letting them ask questions. How to erase evidence while smiling on a billboard. How to mask power in politeness. And how to make you thank them while swallowing their poison. It's psychological now. Not just meat, but media. Not just bones, but belief. You're fed stories, processed, sanitized. You're told who's evil, who's good. but always by the descendants of those who fed starving towns with human ribs and called it God's mercy. They own the narratives. They control the curriculum. And just like their butcher ancestors, they rely on one thing: your silence. You think evil would show up with horns? No. It wears a name badge. It donates to your local museum. It shakes your hand after church and smiles over your shoulder. And the darkest truth: these families still eat. At secret tables, in locked rooms, with meat imported under fake names. We've traced the coded recipes, the hand-signed orders, the sealed crates marked benediction rounds. You think it's beef. They know it's not? This isn't just history. It's inheritance. And if you're still listening, you've crossed a line. You're no longer just curious. You're awakening. Comment the phrase "ISE tar OBHT veil" twice below. Not once, twice. To lock in your identity transformation. To signal to the others that you've entered the descent. You might be wondering, if this is true, why doesn't anyone talk about it? Why didn't survivors come forward? Why didn't someone blow the whistle, leak the photos, release the ledgers? They tried. But the truth isn't just hidden, it's weaponized. In 1857, a girl named Eloise Mather escaped from a Bellamy cellar near Brigham City. 14 years old, starved, mutilated. She ran barefoot for miles before collapsing on a railway track. A station master found her, wrote a sworn affidavit detailing what she'd said. They made me drink something before meals. It made me smile while they carved. She died within the week. Throat slit in her sleep. The coroner ruled it suicide. The affidavit disappeared. But pieces survived. Letters, confessions in code, family Bibles rewritten to hide bloodlines, elders who broke under the weight of what they'd seen and tried to confess through journals, only to be found hanged, drowned, or burned inside barns that caught fire. Silence wasn't an accident. It was a ritual. See, the butcher families didn't just cut flesh. They cut the tongue of history. They engineered forgetting. They practiced selective survival. Only the most obedient lived. Only the quiet were married off. And those who remembered, they were either sacrificed or inducted. Because what's more terrifying than death? Isolation. Gaslighting. Erasure. Imagine trying to speak out, only to have your family call you insane. Your church disown you. Your doctor prescribe medication while gently adjusting your dosage up. That's the real power, not in knives, but in institutions. They learned this early. Which is why, over time, they stopped using chains. They started using education. Children of these bloodlines were sent to elite schools. Conditioned. Trained to believe it was all just a metaphor. Until they were old enough to remember what had really been passed down. They weren't taught history. They were taught obedience. And in return, wealth, status, clean hands, and a dirty lineage. This is why no one speaks. Because the moment you do, you're hunted by a system that never forgot where it came from. And it always eats its own. So if your stomach turns when you hear these words, good. You're human. But if part of you feels a strange familiarity, you might not be as far from the bloodline as you think. Walk through any old town in Utah, or even your own neighborhood, and you'll see them. Strange markings carved into stone lintels, etched into window panes, pressed into the iron of antique meat hooks. You think they're decoration, artisan flair, mason's pride. They're not. They're brands, symbols of allegiance, marks of the flesh trade. The Cotters used a spiral cut with 3 tails. The Greeleys preferred an inverted chalice. The Bellamys branded their wagons with a sun split down the middle, half black, half bleeding red. Every family had their own, and they weren't just to mark tools or meat crates. They were meant to mark people. Some were tattooed, some burned, some carved, softly, onto the inside of the lower lip, a place no one would notice unless they were looking hard. These marks weren't just about identification. They were about control. Because symbols speak to something deeper than words. They're a language that bypasses the conscious mind and speaks to the oldest part of you. The part that doesn't question, the part that remembers. Now here's where it gets darker. In 1956, a team of child psychologists in Ogden found that certain children responded with uncontrollable fear when shown images of these ancient brands, even though the symbols were meaningless. One child screamed for 2 straight hours. Another passed out. One, a 4-year-old boy adopted from a Mormon orphanage, drew the same inverted chalice every day for weeks using red crayon. He said it came to him, hoon dreams, coincidence, or is memory written in the body? These symbols have never left, they've just changed forms. Look at corporate logos, military insignias, fashion designs. Now ask yourself, why do some of the world's most powerful companies echo these ancient brands? Precisely, geometrically, subtly. Because symbolism is ownership. When you see it, and don't recognize it, they own your sight. When you wear it without understanding, they own your body. And when it enters your subconscious, through media, through food, through faith, they own your mind. That's the butcher's true legacy, not just bloodlines, but branded souls. So start seeing, really seeing. Because if you don't know who marked you, you'll never know who's still carving. This is where most men break, not because it's too dark, but because they begin to see themselves in the story. Because now we ask, what if it's not just Utah? What if the taste for human flesh was never a glitch, but a design? What if you've already been conditioned to crave it? Let's talk about appetite, not just for food, but for violence, degradation, power, humiliation, submission. What you watch, what you cheer for, what you eat. In the 1960s, a psychological conditioning experiment was conducted under a now declassified program you were never meant to hear about, Project Telon. It was simple: expose individuals to extreme imagery, torture, consumption, mutilation, but slowly associate it with pleasure, laughter, reward. Over time, the subjects didn't recoil, they smiled. They called it reversal training, the inversion of moral instinct. But here's the kicker: it was later discovered that the program wasn't a failure. It was rolled out through television, through cartoons, through reality shows, through horror as comedy. You were taught, generation by generation, to enjoy your own devouring. And now, you eat violence in every form: emotional, spiritual, symbolic. You cheer when your enemies are cancelled. When the mob rips someone to shreds. You laugh at torture in media. You devour humiliation as entertainment. You swallow narratives whole, no matter how grotesque, because they're seasoned with just the right amount of dopamine. You were made to love the taste of blood. And the worst part? The meat doesn't even have to be literal anymore. They found something better than cannibalism. They created a culture where you devour each other, reputationally, sexually, ideologically. You offer yourself on a digital altar. You serve pieces of your identity to strangers for likes. You brand your children in the same system. You beg for more. That's the new flesh trade. You are both product and consumer. You eat and are eaten. This isn't about history anymore. This is about right now. So I'll ask again in comment, ISEE twice below. Once to break the spell. Twice to let the others know you're no longer food. You're changing. And they feel it. In 1871, 2 years before Utah was officially declared a state, construction began on a building never listed on any official map. Beneath Zion Canyon, carved into the base of a red rock wall known locally as the Hanging Cross. The structure was called, in recovered architectural notes, Facility B12, but the families had another name for it: the Root School. Not a school in the way you know it: no desks, no pencils, no history textbooks. This was a place for the next generation of butchers, the children born into bloodlines too precious to be left to chance. These weren't just kids. They were inheritors, heirs to hunger, taught in silence underground by men who never showed their faces, fed flesh in ceremony, blindfolded before every meal. You want to know what elite grooming really looks like? It's not Harvard. It's not the Skull and Bones. It's a windowless room where a child is asked to identify the part of a body, not by sight, but by taste. And if they cry, they're locked in the salt room. A chamber with no light, just walls coated in curing salts, and the lingering stench of betrayal. We have testimonies from a man known only as Subject R, raised in the Root School until age 14, escaped during a canyon flood in 1912, found in a mining town broken, unable to speak. Years later, through a recovered tape recording, he whispered, "They said eating made us closer to God. But it made me feel hollow. They told me it would give me strength, but all I got was silence in my head, like someone else had moved in. Moved in." You begin to understand now. This wasn't just about consumption. It was about possession, a flesh-based transference of identity, an ancient belief that by devouring another human, especially the young or the pure, you gain not only their strength, but access to something beyond, something old, something still watching. And the school. It was sealed by dynamite in 1923, after a string of disappearances drew too much attention, but its blueprints match a facility built decades later under a different name, one with federal funding. They never ended the Root School. They franchised it. And if you've ever felt something hollow inside you, like a hunger that's not yours, maybe it's not. Maybe it came with the blood. Let's talk about the thing you've never said out loud, the craving that arrives at night, the hunger that doesn't make sense. It's not for food, not really. It's for something else. Something darker. Something forbidden. And here's what they never wanted you to realize: it's not yours. It's inherited. You see, appetite isn't just biological, it's ritualized memory. Hunger is a language, passed down through generations like trauma, like bone, like blood. If your ancestors consumed flesh, not metaphorically, but literally, that act encoded itself into their nervous system. And you're just the next carrier of that code. You were born with a taste you can't explain, a need you can't locate, a shadow in your gut whispering, feed me. And they count on that, because once you start chasing that unnamed hunger, you can be steered, guided toward ideologies, identities, obsessions. You become a magnet for their systems, the carnivals of violence, the endless media gore, the worship of domination. You don't realize you're being fed a diet of psychic meat, shredded humanity repackaged as entertainment, injected with artificial soul. And every time you take a bite, every time you choose rage over reason, power over peace, consumption over creation, the taste deepens. The flavor thickens, and that thing inside you, it grows stronger. They called it the living hunger in the root school texts, an ancient force, pre-language, pre-morality, not evil, just empty. It doesn't want your life. It wants your legacy. It wants to wear your name, walk in your skin, pass itself down through your sons. And the sickest part, they taught some of those children to love it, to cradle the hunger like a sacred fire, to protect it, to feed it fresh dreams, fresh pain, fresh bodies. It wasn't a curse to them. It was a gift. A ticket to something higher, something colder than human. Now ask yourself, what parts of you were born, and what parts were fed into you? You're not just unlearning history now. You're purging what's not yours. Because when you finally name the hunger, you stop being its vessel. You stop the bloodline. There's something more terrifying than a well-hidden monster. A monster that no longer hides at all. Look around you. The signs aren't subtle anymore. They're televised, celebrated, even sold on t-shirts. The symbols of ancient blood cults, the gestures once whispered only in backrooms, now flash proudly across global stages, masked as fashion, entertainment, satire. But here's the trick: they realized they didn't have to hide if they could make you laugh. If they could dress horror in irony. Wrap ancient evil in pop culture. Turn sacrifice into spectacle. Cannibalism into metaphor. Ritual into meme. So when you see the singer bathed in crimson on stage, or the socialite wearing necklaces shaped like human organs, you don't flinch. You smirk. You say, it's just art. You say, it's just a joke. But what if it isn't? What if you're watching centuries-old ceremonies, repackaged for passive consumption? What if the performance is the point? Not to hide the truth, but to test your response to it. Because here's what they learned from generations of secret rule: you only need to hide when people remember how to feel. But the modern world doesn't feel, it scrolls. Numbness is the new armor, outrage is fleeting, and horror, that's just Tuesday. They studied your psychology like scripture. They knew that if they fed you fear in small doses, drip by digital drip, eventually you'd stop noticing. You'd become desensitized, disarmed. You'd see a child on a leash at a red carpet event and call it fashion. You'd hear about late parties with human meat replicas and say, oh, that's just performance art. Because denial is easier than the alternative. Because if you admit it's real, then you have to ask yourself what else you've ignored, what else you've normalized, what you might be complicit in. And here's the final twist of the knife they want you to know. Not all of it, not the core, but enough to create impotent awareness. Just enough truth to make you feel powerless. They want the conspiracy to seem too big, too far gone, too institutional to fight. So you do nothing. You keep watching. You keep feeding it attention. And they smile, because silence is no longer their shield. Your apathy is. Names carry weight. Not just in society, but in something far deeper. Older. They aren't just identifiers. They're rituals spoken aloud. Every time you speak a name like Rothschild, Windsor, Astor, DuPont, you're not just referencing people. You're invoking dynasties, contracts, covenants. Echoes of dark promises sealed in blood and fire long before your grandparents were born. Because these families don't just pass down fortune, they pass down functions. In the ancient world, names were sacred, almost magical. To know someone's true name was to gain power over them. In certain traditions, naming a child was not just a declaration. It was a spell, a claim, an initiation. So what happens when a family name isn't just noble, but ritually consecrated? What happens when generations of initiates, bound by blood and rite, repeat oaths taken in Latin, in Babylonian, in tongues not heard by common ears for millennia? The result is what you see today: men and women who wield power not because of their talent or merit, but because they were born under a name whispered during firelit ceremonies, with witnesses not of this world. These names are more than legacies. They're living sigils. The bloodline becomes the vessel, the heir becomes the host, the name becomes the key. It's why you never see true outsiders rise to the top without being absorbed. Through marriage, ritual, or assimilation, you don't just become one of them. By luck. You enter the bloodline, and with it, the contract. That's why generation after generation they preserve it. They control breeding, curate marriages, orchestrate accidents for black sheep. Because to them, the bloodline is sacred, not in a spiritual sense, but in a functional one. It's the conduit. Through it flows not just wealth, but ancient energy, control, and through it, something older and more terrifying than money continues to move unseen beneath the skin of the world. You can change the face, you can change the voice, but the name remains. And it always collects its debt. It wasn't marked on any map. Even drones flying overhead report signal interference. Locals don't speak of it. And those who deliver goods to the front gate are instructed never to look up at the top floor windows, under threat of legal action or worse. But the mansion exists. Its foundations are older than the state it's in, older than the republic. Some say older than the country itself. You won't find it on Zillow or Satellite View. The land was once native, then absorbed through purchase by the family's great-grandfather in 1791. But the deal wasn't made in cash, it was sealed in ritual. According to rumor, the ground itself was once used by indigenous priests for seasonal blood ceremonies. The soil is considered alive, hungry. So when the family built the estate, stone by stone, each one engraved with a mark, they didn't just build a home, they built a conduit, an altar disguised as luxury. Every room in the house is aligned with astrological constellations. There's a library with no index, yet the books rearrange themselves monthly, always keeping the forbidden knowledge just out of reach, unless you already know the ritual to summon it. The chandelier in the grand dining hall, it's said to be constructed from the bones of deer sacrificed during a full lunar eclipse. Each year, a feast is held under it, but no outsiders are ever invited, and every time, one chair remains empty. Always. Even the mirrors in the home are rumored to be more than decorative. Guests have reported seeing faces not their own, and being watched even when alone. But the most disturbing feature, the basement, it's not locked, it's not hidden, it's just avoided. Children in the house are told never to go downstairs, and the few who did never returned the same. The last documented case was a niece, age 7. She walked in humming. She came out 5 minutes later, completely silent. She hasn't spoken since. Caretakers say the basement breathes. Literally, like lungs expanding and collapsing in the dark. Some have tried to wall it off. Brick it in. The bricks crack open overnight. This is the house that eats time, swallows memory, and changes the blood of all who live within it. And the family? They don't move out. They serve it. It was bound in human skin. That much is confirmed. A thick, leathery volume, stitched along the spine with a thread that forensic experts later determined to be ligaments, not linen. The ink? Animal blood. The language? Not Latin, not Greek, not anything known. It sits behind a triple locked glass case in the family's private study. Not displayed. Contained. The book has no title on the cover. No identifying marks except a scorched handprint on the back that has never faded. Some family members call it the ledger. Others whisper its older name, the weight. Its pages record everything. Births,
Deaths, marriages, curses,
promises made and broken, deals struck beneath eclipses, rituals performed incorrectly, every deviation, every punishment, every name removed from the family line, every blood sacrifice made to appease the thing below. And yet, 3 pages are missing. Not torn, redacted. In 1972, a federal official, name stricken from records, was granted brief, unauthorized access to the estate during a property dispute that had stalled for 40 years. He wandered into the study while the family slept. He opened the ledger. He turned 1 page too many. By sunrise, the house was surrounded, not by police, by agents in unmarked black vehicles with radiation detectors and theological advisors. The ledger was seized. Temporarily. It was taken to a classified location, not Langley, not Quantico, but somewhere beneath the Nevada desert. A vault sealed with lead and prayer. Only 3 pages were copied before the book began emitting low frequency sounds that made 2 analysts bleed from their eyes. Those 3 pages are gone. Redacted from every known archive. Even FOI requests yield only blank paper and a note, classified under Executive Order 093B Hostile Ontology. Rumors persist that the contents of the missing pages include a contractual agreement with a non-human entity, signed by a child who died and came back, wrong. A map showing not just this mansion, but 3 other sites across the country, all linked by Lee lines and bloodlines. And a prophecy, written backward, dated 2026, predicting the awakening of something beneath the basement floor. The family won't discuss it. The government denies it. But one former intelligence officer, now dying of a fast-spreading cancer, said this in his final interview. It wasn't a ledger. It was a warning label. For Earth. They sealed the door with 6 types of metal and a 7th they wouldn't name. Every blueprint of the estate shows a solid foundation. No crawl space, no cellar. But in 1989, during seismic retrofitting, a worker's jackhammer pierced something hollow beneath the east wing. The ground hissed. Not escaped air. Not gas breath. A slow, rhythmic exhale that fogged the worker's goggles. He staggered back, dropped his equipment, and reportedly began reciting the Lord's Prayer in reverse. Though he was agnostic and had never read a Bible, he was institutionalized the next day, repeating just one word over and over, Mother. They dug carefully. Only once, only a few feet, until the soil turned black and pulpy, like decayed tissue. Then they stopped. Whatever they uncovered wasn't a room. It was a cavity, a space shaped like a womb, lined with strange carvings not etched but grown. And at its center a stone altar, smooth and warm to the touch as if it had just been used. The altar bled when struck. Historians couldn't explain it. Geologists refused to return. One archaeologist allegedly lost their hair overnight after spending a single hour near the exposed chamber. The family covered the hole with layers of holy soil imported from Jerusalem, pressed it with iron crosses, then paved it over with an antique grand piano weighing 2,000 pounds. But still at night, the staff reports hearing music. Not from the piano, but from beneath it, a humming. A lullaby with no melody, just rhythm. One long inhale, one long exhale, like something is sleeping or pretending to. The family's patriarch, the last to carry the original surname, once whispered to a confidante while drunk, "It's not trapped. It's waiting. We're not its prison. We're its cradle. Why build a mansion over such a place? Because they had to. The bloodline was sworn to it, bound by ink, skin, and the ledger, to keep it warm, to feed its secrets, to raise the world's noise so its cries wouldn't be heard. Every generation, someone must go into the room. And every generation, one doesn't come back. Those who survive, they come back with gray eyes and no shadow. And now, according to the prophecy in the redacted page, the room is about to open itself. They thought the pact was airtight, inked in blood and sealed by the first matriarch's final breath, etched into the skin of every newborn in the line with a sacred iron needle. Every child was marked, every soul accounted for. Except one. She wasn't supposed to live. Her mother, Lydia, was the youngest of the Hollingsworth heirs, a timid, quiet woman, often seen whispering to the trees, often missing from the nightly rituals. They said she wasn't right in the head, that she heard things before they happened. When she became pregnant out of wedlock, the elders demanded the child be offered, not killed. Offered, a distinction with a fate far worse, but Lydia fled. She ran the night the child was due, into the woods, past the scorched boundary stones, through the salt line they'd carved into the earth for 200 years to keep it contained. She gave birth in a cave, no doctor, no midwife. Just her, the howling wind, and the slow thunder of something stirring beneath the soil. The child was born silent, no cry, no gasp, just open eyes and a steady stare. And most importantly, no mark. The pact hadn't touched her. The cradle of power had missed her completely. The family hunted them for 3 months. They found Lydia's body hanging upside down in the orchard, her skin carved with symbols meant to summon rain. Symbols she had mutilated to look like counter spells. She died fighting, but the child? She vanished. Some say she was taken by wolves, others say by something worse. But in the years that followed, things began to change. The room, the womb beneath the floorboards, grew restless. The breathing became labored, irregular. The fog it exhaled turned cold. The music twisted into screams played backward. Staff began to disappear again. The house started cracking in places that should have been soundproof. And in the library, pages that were once redacted began to bleed through with names written in a child's handwriting. The final entry? I never wanted to be born, but now I know why I was. I'm not the last Hollingsworth. I'm its end. The bloodline's cradle was no longer enough. She was coming home, not to honor the pact, to burn it. It began with the sound of weeping wood. Not rain. Not wind. But the sound of walls sobbing, as if the house itself had realized what was coming and finally felt regret. The portraits cried crimson from their eyes, thick and slow, pooling at the bottom of gilded frames. The grandfather clock began ticking backward, chiming 13 times at midnight. Every living member of the Hollingsworth bloodline, those who had remained, Those still clinging to their robes and rights, gathered in the grand chamber, they didn't speak aloud anymore, only in thoughts. Their mouths hadn't moved in years. But that night, one by one, their jaws unlocked. The matriarch, ancient and withered, her spine twisted into the shape of a question mark, rose from her throne of bones. She began the ritual of rebinding, meant to reinforce the blood pact, to reseal the cracks forming between generations. They thought they could tighten the chain. But she was already inside. Not the house, not the room. Inside them, the girl who bore no mark, the pact breaker, the womb born without tether. She had grown, yes, but not into a woman, into something outside the contract, a spiritual orphan who had learned the language of undoing. One by one they dropped to the floor, clutching their stomachs, bleeding from their ears, vomiting names in reverse, not murdered, unwritten. She didn't kill them. She pulled them out of the story, erased their birth, their rights, their sacrifices. She rewound the bloodline from within their own memories. Some tried to flee, only to vanish mid-step, their bodies folding into ash. Others screamed themselves into silence, their tongues turning black and brittle. The house shuddered. Windows exploded inward, not outward. Mirrors rippled like water, showing each resident what they looked like without sin, and in most cases that meant invisible. Then the walls' blood. Actual blood, not metaphor. It poured from the ceilings, from the chandeliers, from the cracks in the fireplace. It wasn't random. It formed words, inscriptions, and warnings. And one phrase again and again. This house was never yours. You were just squatting in a tomb. By dawn, the Hollingsworth name had been struck from every legal record. Every painting, document, and gravestone bearing it crumbled to dust. The estate itself, gone from the land registry. But the land remembered? And so did she. She didn't free the family. She freed the house. There had always been something off about the nursery. No matter how often it was repainted, the walls peeled. No matter how many lamps were lit, the corners remained unnaturally dark, and no matter how many lullabies were sung, babies cried louder in that room. Louder and longer, until their voices just stopped. Sometimes after days, sometimes after hours. The family blamed weak lungs. But it wasn't the lungs, it was her. Or rather it, buried beneath the floorboards of that very room, sealed in a hexagon of charred iron nails and baby teeth, was the original pact. The first binding the Hollingsworth ancestors ever made. It wasn't written on paper. It wasn't signed with ink. It was carved into a newborn's bones. Their firstborn daughter, 1791. They gave her no name, because names grant freedom and she was meant to be held, a bridge between worlds. A permanent toll paid to the whispering thing that had granted the Hollingsworths their unnatural longevity, their riches, their power. The pact had one rule. As long as she sleeps, you thrive. So they fed her opium, laudanum, and crushed nightshade, whatever kept her quiet. They fed her even in death, preserved her, mummified her in salt and secrets. They made her the cornerstone of the house. But time has teeth, and silence always ends. When the girl, with no mark, the final descendant, broke from the blood ritual and walked barefoot into the nursery, the boards warped beneath her steps. Not because she was cursed, because she was expected. She whispered one word, wake. The floor split like rotten fruit. And there she was, the boneless husk of the forgotten daughter, her eye sockets filled with black flowers, her ribcage pulsing with something alive. And the thing they had fed for centuries, still not full. It didn't climb out. It didn't need to. It bloomed. The roots of it spread through every hallway, pulling down chandeliers and memories. And as it unraveled the house, it also unraveled the family's protection. The lineage collapsed like a web on fire. Their powers, their fortunes, their whispers in Parliament, all gone like steam. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just closed the nursery door behind her. Some say the house still stands. Others say it never existed. But sometimes in the woods where it once was, travelers hear crying. Not baby cries. The cries of a house that remembers what it held. And what it lost. Forever.